The multiverse of Marvel Comics is vast and varied and complicated, so incredibly complicated. There are layers upon layers upon layers to this in both a metaphorical and a literal sense. But despite its complexity, and in fact often because of it, it is a fascinating place. I mean, over 80 years of lore and world building and storytelling have combined to make the Marvel Multiverse what it is today. But as cool as it all is, 80 years of lore is not always the easiest thing to learn about, and that is what I am here to help with today. I have spent many hours preparing my longest video ever, a full feature-length breakdown of as much vital multiverse lore as I could cram into about 2 hours. We are going to be talking about the history of the Marvel Multiverse, the cosmic entities that both maintain and oppose it, and the structure and layout of the entire place, plus a lot of other information scattered in there. If you've ever wondered about things like where the multiverse comes from, who created Galactus, why does the Beyonder look like that sometimes, or many other questions, you are in the right place. Welcome to Sir Superhero's definitive guide to the entire cosmology of the Marvel Multiverse. The history section of this video is going to start where you'd think it would, at the beginning of everything. So we're going to rewind all the way back to the beginning of the universe, and then we're going to blow right past it. See, the Marvel Universe that you probably think of when I say Marvel Universe wasn't actually the first one. There was another iteration of existence before it, and as we move our timeline back, we're going to crash right out of the current existence and go all the way back to that one. Then we're going to rewind to the beginning of that universe and blow right past it again. Then we are going to repeat this entire process a few more times and eventually end up at the first iteration of reality. At this point, there was only one being in existence. Well, maybe technically two. The one above all was also probably doing his thing, but we'll get to him later. The one being that was actually in reality was called the First Firmament. Though saying that the First Firmament was in reality isn't technically the most accurate, it would be better to say that it was reality. The First Firmament was the embodiment of the universe itself. It was everything, and everything was it. This odd existence meant that the First Firmament was all-powerful, but even an all-powerful being eventually got lonely, and so it created, making two groups of beings to fill the void, later known as the Aspirants and the Celestials. Both the Aspirants and the Celestials were also capable of creating on their own, and they began populating the void of the First Firmament with lots of proto-experiments towards later creation. However, they differed on how exactly this should be done, and this caused a war between them. The Aspirants were solely dedicated to their creator, seeking the direction and approval of the First Firmament for everything that they made. This meant that their creation was well crafted, but extremely rigid and structured. Meanwhile, the Celestials experimented with change. They didn't think that life should be put into these solid structures, they thought that it should be allowed to grow and shift and evolve. The differences between the two factions proved irreconcilable, leading to a conflict which grew so large that it shattered the universe of the First Firmament entirely. Though both factions would survive this battle, the Celestials were the ones that won out in terms of ideology. This is where I get to introduce a very important concept, the fact that reality itself is evolving too. This is going to be what the next several minutes of this video are going to be about, going through every time that the entirety of reality has been destroyed and then rebuilt. Every time this happens, something new gets added as existence evolves, becoming more detailed and refined. These iterations are referred to as cosmos. The First Firmament was the first cosmos, and when the First Firmament was shattered, we entered the second cosmos, and so on. So now the question is, what changed between the first and second cosmos? Well, if you're a really deep lore head and you've been overanalyzing everything I've said, you might have noticed that I've chosen some of my words very carefully. I said that the Celestial War shattered the universe of the First Firmament, and with that, you may be able to guess what came next. The first cosmos introduced existence as a baseline concept. There was one reality and one entity, that being the First Firmament, and then all of his creations. When the universe that was the First Firmament was shattered, we entered the second cosmos, which was the first appearance of the Multiverse. This is the origin of the multiverse in Marvel Comics. Yeah, you know the whole timeline branching thing that the MCU does? Marvel Comics gets into that a little bit later, but the base origin is so much weirder. So the first cosmos is shattered, parallel realities now exist, and the landscape of everything is so incredibly different that we consider it the second cosmos. And with a second cosmos comes a second firmament, another being that embodies the entirety of existence. You might think that the second cosmos would be a very complicated one because introducing the multiverse is a huge thing, but no, the second cosmos was relatively short-lived, and it was the fault of the Celestials. When the first firmament exploded, the Celestials didn't die, they survived in the fragments, and were very happy that this was their new state of being. After all, they wanted to see life grow and change and evolve, and now there were way more opportunities for that to happen, so they started experimenting again, and one of their experiments was a little thing called death. Before the Celestials had this wild idea, everything that existed would just keep existing infinitely because the idea of something ending hadn't been invented yet, as wild as that is to say. The Celestials tried experimenting more and more and eventually realized that infinite existence in every way wasn't so great, so they invented the idea of things going away, boom, death. And when the Celestials came up with this crazy pitch, the second firmament, the cosmic embodiment of all reality across the entire multiverse, thought, death, that sounds interesting, let's try it. So it died, and the third cosmos began. Though before we get to that, there is one other very important event that happens in the second cosmos, that being the Celestials creating lesser but still incredibly powerful beings to help them manage their creation. These beings were originally called the Omegas, but would later be known as the Beyonders. Yes, like that Beyonder and those Beyonders. We'll come back to them later. The third cosmos is where the cycle of reality death and rebirth really starts going. After all, the first one didn't technically die, it was just shattered into the multiverse that became the second cosmos. That one did go through total death, returning to nothingness, and that nothingness eventually gave rise to the third cosmos. As will be the question for all of these resets, we now have to ask what gets added this time. How does reality evolve and what appears in the new universe? The first one was just basic existence in a singular fashion, the second one introduced parallel existence, and the third cosmos introduced conflict and narrative. One thing that I'm going to return to about 1 billion times in this video is the idea that storytelling is central to reality itself. Narrative is basically a force of nature in Marvel. This is a huge theme across a lot of different Marvel stories, and it is baked right into their cosmology. Having learned the ideas of life and death from the previous cosmos, the third cosmos pitted those two against each other, staging a gigantic battle of existence versus non-existence. Two beings arose naturally in this reality. The first was known as Lifebringer 1, and it was a force for existence, for life, often called the first hero. Its opponent was a being known as the Anti-All, non-existence, death, the first villain. They fought, Lifebringer 1 was victorious, and thus existence continued. Now this is pretty basic, I'm not really skimming any details here, that's all that happened. It is the most slimmed down good guy versus bad guy story that you can possibly have, but that is intentional. I know this is all super weird, cosmic, philosophical, almost religious stuff to wrap your head around, but remember that at this stage of existence, narrative itself was new. Death had just been invented, so the idea that life and death could conflict, boy, that was a huge thing at the time, and we will see it iterated more in future cosmos. Eventually, the third cosmos comes to an end, as all things must, and from that nothingness afterwards, the fourth cosmos arises. Whereas conflict at its most base form was created in the third cosmos, the fourth one introduces character. It takes that base idea of good versus evil and explores the different forms that those can take. However, at this stage, the characters are still pretty baseline and can be represented as archetypes, heroes and villains, but one step above good guy and bad guy, going into what essentially are tropes that superheroes and villains often fit into. There's a whole bunch of these, which you can see on your screen now, but let's go through a couple specific examples of them that I think highlight exactly how the archetypes work the best. One archetype was named Of Past, which exemplified man-out-of-time type stories, someone coming from the past into the future and having to deal with the trials that brings. As you might be able to guess, this kind of archetype is what we see in later heroes like Captain America. Another archetype was named Of Vengeance, representing heroes who are less motivated by purely positive things and more driven by revenge. This is like what we see in Ghost Rider and the Punisher. Some are a little bit more introspective. For example, the archetype that would later represent Spider-Man was known as could be you, meaning it was an everyman type that people can see themselves in and aspire to be like. At this point, we are halfway through the cycles to the main Marvel Universe, and I'm going to do a quick recap in a slightly different way because things are going to change a little bit for the rest of these. A good framework that I use when thinking about the cosmos is to imagine that each one of them is asking a question. The first cosmos asked the question, what if things existed? The second cosmos actually asked two, what if multiple things existed? And also, what if those things could end? The question of the third cosmos is derived from the previous two. We have multiple things and those things can end, so what if the things disagreed on when and what things should end? The answer is that they would fight about it. And then the fourth cosmos asks another question about these fighters. What if these fighters had personalities, had traits unique to them? How would that change their conflicts if these fighters were people? Now we get to the fifth cosmos. The question that this one poses actually relates less to the characters and more to the world around them. The fifth cosmos asks, well, if we have these fighters, where are the fights happening? And its solution is magic. The fifth cosmos introduced a way that the world could be defined outside of just characters. After all, magic itself as a concept is not alive, but it can be used by living things to make alterations to the world within a set of guidelines. To compare this to the writing process, which if you haven't figured it out yet, is exactly what this whole cycle is an allegory for, this is like world building. We have our conflict, we have our characters, now we're going to establish some rules for the setting that these characters and conflicts exist in. Magic provides this. It is something about the world that can be known and taught and learned, and it works more or less the same way every time, but it's not perfectly similar, and that's where the sixth cosmos comes in. Magic is excellent for world building, but in many cases it is by definition flexible and subjective. Magic is weird and twisty and can be altered and corrupted in a lot of different ways. This is great in many cases, but if you really want to create a solid foundation for world building, you might want something a little bit more structured, more objective, and that is what we can call science. This is what the sixth cosmos introduced. The fifth cosmos asked the question, what if there was a world that the characters could affect? The sixth cosmos asks, what if there were parts of the world that they could not affect? Objective physics that lay a structure throughout everything. So at this point, we have pretty much every ingredient needed to tell a good story well established. The idea to tell a story in the first place comes from the first and second cosmos, the conflict and characters come from the third and fourth, and the setting rules come from number 5 and 6, the flexible ones coming from 5, and the objective ones that cannot change coming from 6. Now the question becomes, what's left? What else do we need? And the answer is nothing. We have all the ingredients, we can tell the stories. The seventh cosmos is the Marvel Universe as we know it. Kind of. Technically, there's an eighth. This is where things are going to get weird. This is where things are going to get weird, I say, as if this already hasn't been weird cosmic philosophy, but I mean, it's going to get weirder for a minute, more superhero-y at least. Remember how I said that the Beyonders existed and we would come back to them later? We're going to go over them in more detail during Act 2 of this video, but yeah, they were still around and they were monitoring the universe for existential threats. Eventually, they found one. This was a being called Enigma, which weirdly isn't actually that important to this cosmological topic as a whole. Plus, if I tried to explain him in detail, it would be a minimum 15 to 20 minute tangent, so he can get his own video later. Suffice to say for now, he was big and he was really dangerous. The Beyonders were watching the events that could possibly lead to the creation of Enigma and decided that if he was ever able to reach his maximum potential, he would take over everything. And I mean everything full stop. If Enigma reaches maximum power, no more reality, death, and recreation cycle. He just controls everything and all of existence bends to his whims. The Beyonders do not want this to happen, and they decide that their best course of action is to essentially force a recreation cycle, move reality from the 7th cosmos to the 8th, therefore making everything so different that Enigma will not rise to power. Yes, this basically means their plan was unplugging the universe and plugging it back in again. One slight problem with that, if the Beyonders actually set off their multiverse bomb and unplug Cosmos number 7, everything and everyone in 7 dies. So everyone who finds out about this plan from the inside starts fighting against it, and they all fail, except for Dr. Doom. Doom manages to basically hijack the Beyonder's plan and save little chunks of a bunch of different realities, fusing them into one singular planet-like structure which is referred to as Battleworld, and that Doom now reigns over as God Emperor. This is what the 2015 Secret Wars event is all about. It is stories taking place in various parts of Battleworld, all overseen by God Doom, as a few surviving members of the 7th Cosmos try to fight against him and restore things to the way it was. Eventually, through determination, willpower, and one old burger that Miles Morales had in his pocket, not a joke, that's actually what happened, I love this comic, the heroes succeed and Battleworld is restored to a full multiverse. Kind of. Some things are quite different. Most everything remained identical on the surface, to such an extent that if you pick up a pre-2015 or post-2015 comic, the vast majority of the time you're not going to notice any differences. But from a cosmological standpoint, I mean, the entire multiverse got destroyed except for like less than 1% of it, and then was regenerated from that surviving less than 1%. That was enough of a shift to be considered a new cosmos, the 8th Cosmos. This really only matters when we're talking about cosmic entities, which again is what Act 2 of this video is going to be about. People on the ground did not notice this, and from a lore perspective, you'll be fine if you forget that this is technically a different cosmos than pre-2015, because it really doesn't come up that often. And if you're wondering what question was asked by the 8 Cosmos, what kind of thing was added, nothing this time, but that's because this was not a natural cycle. To put it bluntly, the 8th Cosmos was more like the 7th Cosmos recovering after being shot in the head. It wasn't evolving, it was just trying to go back to normal. So the 8th Cosmos is actually the modern Marvel Universe. If you go to a comic store and pick up a current Marvel comic, it will be set in the 8th Cosmos. Anything pre-2015 is 7th Cosmos, but again, the distinction is not really that important outside of a few cases. So now we're at the present, but before we go on to Act 2 of this video, we can briefly discuss the 9th Cosmos, or at least what the 9th Cosmos might look like. Of course, this is all in the future, and the future has not been written yet, so these are all potential timelines that have been revealed to characters in visions of the future. Which of these is going to prove accurate, I couldn't tell you. In fact, it might just be something else entirely, and these 3 could all prove to be wrong. The first, and in my opinion most likely, shows Franklin Richards as the final survivor of the 8th Cosmos getting ejected into the 9th Cosmos as a cosmic entity through a process that we will go over when we talk about Galactus, because that's what happened to him in Cosmos number 6. The second one, which is going to be absolutely insane to just touch on briefly, shows Hulk merging with the One Below All, which for now I will basically describe as Super Mega Satan, and becoming Super Mega Satan Galactus God, an entity so strong that he breaks everything. Like, he breaks planets and life and light and renders the entire universe dead in Cosmos number 9. The third potential 9th Cosmos stars Venom and Eddie Brock of all characters, but Venom lore is super cosmically related right now. In this possibility, they gain incredible power and take on the mantle of the Anti-All, that first villain avatar of non-existence all the way back from Cosmos number 3. And then, of course, they go on a rampage and destroy a lot of stuff. So right now, the outlooks for the 9th Cosmos are Hulk becomes God and destroys everything, Venom becomes God and destroys everything, or Franklin Richards becomes God and is probably pretty chill because Franklin Richards is a pretty nice guy. So the odds for the 9th aren't looking great so far, but who knows what's actually going to happen? Though, of course, the real answer is that we're not going to see a 9th Cosmos, at least not for a very long time, because that would require Marvel to do a total reboot of everything, and I do not see that in the cards right now. And with that, almost 20 minutes into this thing, we have covered the full history of the Marvel Multiverse, or really multiverses, from a cosmological perspective, which brings us to the end of Act 1 of 3 of this video. Now let's talk about the entities that make all of this stuff function. Now, there are a lot that we're going to have to cover here, and I'm going to make no claims that I am going to talk about every single cosmic entity in Act 2 of this, because there are just so many. Even the ones that I do cover, I'm going to have to hit relatively quickly, because many of these have appeared in hundreds and hundreds of comics, and if I go through the entire history of all of them, we'll be here for a week, which I know some of you would probably like, but I have other things to do. Oh, also very important, unless I say otherwise, assume that every entity I am talking about is the main Marvel version from Universe 616, and other universes may or may not have their own variants of them. Some of these beings are definitely multiversal in level, but when we get to one of those, I will tell you. I'm going to present these to you in a bottom to top sort of hierarchy based roughly on quote unquote power level. But of course, remember, these are cosmic entities. They are often written in a way that is intentionally weird and flexible and difficult to understand. I cannot rank eldritch beings in a tier list for you, so take my order as more of an organizational tool than a solid ranking. The one we're going to start with is actually not a singular cosmic entity, but a group, this being the Watchers. The Watchers are usually presented as cosmic entities, but they're really not in a magical sense, they're just super old. The Watchers as a species are the first advanced beings to ever appear in the universe, and they've been around so long that their technology is cosmic in scale. The reason that they're called the Watchers and act the way they do, kind of like cosmic beings, is because they made a big mistake a very long time ago. They tried to be generous with their technology and use it to uplift a lesser civilization, and so they gave them access to knowledge about nuclear energy. And then the species nuked themselves to death, and the Watchers vowed to only watch and never interfere, which is why they act as cosmic record keepers now. So the Watchers are mortal aliens. They are not cosmic in nature, but they've amassed so much technology and knowledge that they may as well be, and thus usually appear in gatherings of cosmic beings, whatever that may look like. Next up, we have the Elders of the Universe, like the Collector and the Grandmaster, and a whole bunch of other people who are named after the main thing that they do. The Elders of the Universe are not a singular species. In fact, by definition, they are all different species. The thing that ties the Elders together is that each of them is the last member of their kind. In the Marvel Universe, there's this weird energy that has never really been explained called the Power Primordial, which is a cosmic force you gain access to when you are the only member of your species left alive. Best reasoning that I have for this is that somehow if you are the last one, you get access to like the life force or something that whole species would have, and that gives you a lot of different abilities. But Elder of the Universe is not a cosmic designation for these people. As silly as it might sound, Elders of the Universe can best be described as a club for these beings. A long time ago, a bunch of these beings got together and decided that since the Power Primordial made them all immortal, they needed something to occupy their eternal existence and prevent them from going insane, so they all dedicated themselves to a singular pursuit. Most of these are pretty obvious from the name. The Collector wanted to amass a collection of everything that he possibly could. The Gardener wanted to understand and care for plant life across reality. The Champion wanted to fight everybody and be the best at fighting. There's a whole bunch of these, and they all have their one singular thing. New ones can also be admitted if the conditions are ever met and someone is the last member of their kind. But again, club really is the best way to describe them. The Elders of the Universe are not a group that operates with a single goal and purpose like the Watchers. They get together and hang out sometimes, but they operate independently, and some of them occasionally get involved in cosmic level things because they are that strong. Next up in the rough cosmic hierarchy, we have Galactus. Now, a lot of you are probably quite surprised that Galactus is this quick in the ranking, but yeah, that should just tell you how funky things are going to get later. We are going to be on Galactus for a bit though, because unsurprisingly, he's got a lot of lore. Galactus is a singular entity. There is not a species of Galacti, there is just him. However, he holds a role, he has a purpose, and he is not the first one to fulfill that purpose. The role that Galactus serves is known as the Devourer of Worlds, which I will probably just call the Devourer from here on out. It sounds like a very violent job, and it is one, it being an entity that consumes the life force of entire planets. But it is also typically presented as a necessary one, part of what is essentially a system of checks and balances to prevent the infinite growth of reality and keep everything normalized. Though this is also kind of up for debate. Galactus usually has an insatiable cosmic hunger, but this has been removed from him on several occasions, and the universe didn't blow up about it, so I don't know. See, Galactus was not always a gigantic cosmic being. He was once a dude. Just a regular mortal dude. See, here's one of Galactus's baby pictures. Look how cute he is playing with his whatever that thing is. The most important part of Galactus's normal mortal dude nature was that he was a normal mortal dude in the 6th cosmos, way back before the Marvel Universe as we typically understand it. His name was Galen, and when Galen was alive, his universe was being destroyed by a stronger cosmic entity known as the Black Winter. Through sheer coincidence, apparently, Galen ended up being the last entity in his reality to survive, and thus he was ejected into the next one. In the case of Galactus, there are varying accounts of how this happened, and when I say varying accounts in comic book terms, I mean that different writers have described the cause differently, and I don't know which one of them I should take as canon, but the general fact holds true that the final survivor of a previous universe gets ejected into the next one as the Devourer. The archetype of the Devourer seems to go all the way back to Universe 4, but we don't know too much about it at that stage. In Universe number 5, we know the final survivor was a being named Moradun. Moradun then got ejected into Cosmos number 6 as the Devourer known as Omnimax, and then Galen got ejected into Universe number 7 as Galactus. The 7 to 8 transition did not have a new Devourer because, like I said, that was more of a recovery cycle than a new one, but then in Universe 9, there are options as to who it could be, with the most likely being Franklin Richards, as I mentioned earlier. Also, I'm saying universe instead of multiverse here because it does seem like there can be distinct Devourers for each universe within every multiverse, but also info on that is shaky, so whatever. While we're talking about Galactus, I should briefly touch on the power cosmic, which is the energy that Galactus uses and seems to be exclusive or near exclusive to whoever is the Devourer of Worlds at any given time and their heralds. Somewhat surprisingly, what the power cosmic is has never actually been defined, but after researching it quite a bit, I personally think that it is a side effect of having your soul survive a cosmos restructuring cycle. We know that the power cosmic is related to the soul in some capacity. Galactus has referred to it as his soul before, and we also know that if a mortal is imbued with it, it quote-unquote replaces their soul and becomes an incorruptible permanent part of them. So to put it simply, as simple as something this weird can be, the power cosmic is what you get when your soul is present through the creation of the universe. Your soul gets entwined with the universe and gives you some level of control over it. Now, we've talked about Galactus way too long. Even that was only a quick summary, but we have so many other entities that we need to get to. And the next one is also going to be long because now we're going to go a lot deeper into Celestials. I mentioned Celestials a while ago at this point because they were created in the first cosmos by the first firmament. And here's something wild. The Celestials that we see in modern Marvel Comics are the same ones. They have survived all of that time. They are powerful enough to survive the reality destruction and recreation cycles, and in fact, they've actually been known to help kickstart these recreation cycles. After all, the Celestials were first made to help the original firmament populate the universe with life, and that is what they've continued to do. The Celestials can best be described as cosmic scientists and experimenters. They just kind of go around doing things and making things. They definitely aren't evil, but they also aren't strictly good either, as many of their experiments don't care too much for what happens to their subjects. The Celestials are many and varied, having different interests and specialties among them. They are responsible for a lot of superhuman activity on Earth. They created the Eternals and the Deviants directly, and one of them even inserted the X gene into human biology. That's right, the Celestials made mutants. Despite their incredible level of power, the Celestials are cosmic entities in a lower context. They are not all-powerful or omnipotent. They can be killed and have been killed on several occasions. For a while, there was actually a dead Celestial underground on Earth, and cosmic leakage from its corpse is another reason why Earth has such a high concentration of supernatural events. And then Tony Stark and a bunch of other people brought it to life, and that caused a lot of problems, but that's another story. The ancient nature of the Celestials also means that they are the first entities on our list which are multiversal in a way. Remember, the Celestials predate the idea of the multiverse. In fact, their conflict was the thing that created the multiverse in the first place, and then they went forward from there. So different universes have their own Celestials, but they are not variants of the same one. They're just different Celestials who went to different places after the multiverse shattered. The Celestials do also have natural predators in the form of cosmic insects known as the Horde. These beings serve a different cosmic entity known as the Fulcrum, who I will touch on briefly later, but for now I just wanted to at least mention them with the Celestials. And speaking of things I need to mention with the Celestials, the Beyonders. I said I would hit them again in Act 2, here we are. They are not more powerful than the Celestials, they are actually the creations of them, and that's why I'm putting them right after Celestials in this list. I had to talk about the Celestials first. The Beyonders were created really with one degree of separation from the Celestials. The Celestials created a singular being named Kalhora, and then Kalhora created the rest of the Beyonders. But regardless of their exact ancestry, the point of the Beyonders was to assist the Celestials in monitoring the multiverse. In this role, they were not yet called the Beyonders, they were called the Omegas, and their purpose was to do the things that the Celestials didn't want to. With the Omegas around, the Celestials could do whatever experimentation and creation they wanted, and the Omegas would make sure that did not have major negative consequences. This was a great system for a while, until the second Cosmos killed itself. Remember, that was a thing that happened. So no more Omegas, right? Wrong. This is where the transition to Beyonders happens, and where I get to introduce a new concept to you. See, when a cosmos dies or otherwise ceases to exist, not all of it necessarily goes away. Occasionally, pieces of it can remain as pocket dimensions, drifting away from the void and remaining outside of any future cosmos. We'll talk a little bit more about this in Act 3 of the video on multiversal structure, but the Omegas survived in one of these pocket realities, now calling themselves Beyonders as they were beyond the typical multiverse, and continued their work of maintaining things. This is the origin of all of the Beyonders that you have seen in the comics. The old one from the original Secret Wars, the newer ones from the 2015 Secret Wars. They might look quite different, but that's because they can change their appearance at will. They all belong to the same species, though different factions of them have split off. They don't all necessarily follow the exact same ideals or methods. A quick footnote after this, kind of like I had to do with Galactus, the Beyonders are characters who have appeared in a whole bunch of comics and have also gone through a whole bunch of retcons over the years, which is the real reason why they look different every single time. But regardless, this is a decent summary of their current canon, and for time, now we gotta move on to the next ones. That said, the next ones are only entities in a very loose understanding of the word, because we are going to touch very briefly on the Infinity Stones. I went back and forth on including the Infinity Stones in this video at all because they're actually not nearly as important to cosmology as you might think they are, but I decided that people would be curious if I didn't bring it up, so here's how we're going to handle them. The Infinity Stones, or as they were originally called, Infinity Gems, have been around for a very long time, and their status changes extremely frequently based on which comic and era you are reading from. So in lieu of going on an entire tangent about their in-depth history, I'm just going to give you a quick summary of what their canon status is right now, because that's all we really need for this video. The status quo right now is that the Infinity Stones are tiny but very powerful artifacts with history that goes all the way back to the first cosmos, which we mentioned a while ago. They were made all the way back then, but in the modern day, there's a realm called the Quarry of Creation, which, much like Beyond, where the Beyonders are from, is a little chunk of the first cosmos that exists outside of the multiverse. This extra-dimensional bubble is populated by a lot of Celestials and a whole bunch of Infinity Stones just floating around, and sometimes the Celestials disseminate these Infinity Stones into individual universes. Once a stone enters a given universe, it becomes bound to it in one way or another, which I don't believe has ever been explicitly stated, but we can assume by the fact that if you take an Infinity Stone out of its home universe, it doesn't work, so you can't amass them across the multiverse. It is one set for each reality. The different sets of stones between universes can vary in purpose and number, but typically in the main universe there are 6 of them, which are the same that you see in the MCU: time, soul, mind, reality, power, and space. These are the core ones that are consistently seen, but there have been 7th stones which have appeared and vanished over the years. Right now there is a Death Stone floating around, and there has also been an Ego Stone which was destroyed. And then, of course, there are the occasional parody ones. Deadpool briefly wielded a Continuity Stone, which is obviously a joke of dubious canon. And then there's the Abundant Glove from Howard the Duck. Actually, you know what? Let's do some audience participation here and make a game out of this. You can see the Abundant Glove on your screen now. There are 5 Infinity Stones within it. They do not share powers with any stones that I have discussed previously. They are all special to this glove. Try and guess what they are. You get no hints other than this. I will just tell you that getting even one of these would be very difficult, and if you haven't read this comic already, I will be very impressed if any of you get a single stone on this glove correct. You could write your answers in the comments if you want, or just do it in your head, whatever works for you. I'll give you a second to think. Pause the video if you need more. Alright, you ready? The stones that make up the Abundant Glove consist of the Compassion Stone, the Laughter Stone, the Dance Stone, the Respect Stone, and a second different dance stone. Like I said, if you got 1, I'm impressed. If you got 4, you're crazy. And if you got the second dance stone, you're cheating. There's no other explanation. But back to more serious canon, I decided to put the Infinity Stones in the entity section because they are sentient in a way, though it's kind of ill-defined. Right now they are relevant as sentient beings because they are bonded with mortals and having adventures doing that stuff. However, despite the great power at their disposal, the Infinity Stones just kind of aren't really that relevant in the grand scheme of things right now. Maybe because they were overdone a few years ago and Marvel wants to start moving away from them, I don't know, but ultimately that's all I feel I need to say about them in this video. And speaking of semi-sentient energy sources, I also should briefly touch on the Enigma Force, also known as the Unipower, also known as Captain Universe. The Enigma Force is living cosmic energy created by the Beyonders as a tool that they can use to maintain multiversal balance from the outside. On a smaller scale, the Enigma Force often bonds with individual mortals, giving them incredible power for a specific time of need. This is not something that they keep for a long while, they only have this ability when it is absolutely necessary, and while they hold this power, they take on the title Captain Universe. A lot of characters have been Captain Universe over the years, though the one that is definitely most iconic is when Spider-Man had it, more often just called Cosmic Spider-Man instead of Captain Universe though. Captain Universe stuff is also directly related to symbiote things, as the Enigma Force is the light parallel of the living abyss that makes up symbiotes as a species generated by the King in Black. This is a whole wild thing that I am just going to have to introduce very quickly because I cannot go into a super deep dive on specific Venom storylines, but just bear with me, I'll try my best. Basically, while the Beyonders maintain multiversal balance from the outside, they have a counterpart, which is a singular entity named the King in Black, who is supposed to maintain it from the inside. Null, the god of darkness and creator of the symbiotes, was the King in Black of the 8th Cosmos for a while, but he didn't exactly want this title, it was forced upon him and he did not uphold it very well, which is why he is seen as more of a destructive force rather than a balancing one. The title of King in Black is then passed down to Eddie Brock, and this is a whole thing on its own. I could genuinely probably do another 2 to 3 hour video just talking about the cosmological ramifications of this series alone. But for the sake of everyone's sanity, most of all mine, yeah, the Enigma Force is a sentient energy made by the Beyonders to help maintain multiversal balance, and then the King in Black and Living Abyss do that same thing from the inside of the multiverse, but that's rarely actually how it plays out because these two forces fight a lot. At this point, we have covered every major cosmic entity which is a group like the Celestials or a transferable role like Galactus. The next section are going to be ones who can be best described as cosmic embodiments in one way or another. But before we get to that, I have to do a whole sidebar that I don't really want to do, but feel obligated to because of how weirdly relevant it is, talking about Gods, and that is Gods, an acronym. Gods was a series that Marvel began releasing in 2023. It was only 8 issues long, it was awesome, and I hate it. Let me explain that very weird inconsistency. Gods tried to do something incredibly ambitious, which was redefine Marvel's entire magic and cosmic sphere at a fundamental level. It acknowledged that the cosmology of Marvel had gone through a lot of different retcons over decades, and it wanted to unify that and bring some clarity to it, which it did decently well. The problem with this was that this topic, and therefore Gods in general, was incredibly niche in terms of target audience. Let me put it this way, if you have liked this YouTube video up to this point, my god, you would love this series. But not everybody is into this kind of thing. Some people just want to read about Spider-Man punching people, and to be so clear, I'm not saying that that's bad or lesser in any sense. People have different preferences, and I will be the first to admit that this kind of cosmology is a more niche thing within the audience of Marvel. The problem that this caused for Gods, though, was that it wasn't popular at all, even though it was really supposed to be. Gods was meant to be an ongoing series, and one that had huge implications for Marvel canon in its entirety. But then it didn't sell super well, and some of the creative team ended up getting other commitments, and so the series was canceled really abruptly, hence it only running for 8 issues. So imagine this, the series is grand and massive in scale and really ambitious and impressive for 7 issues, and then they have to wrap up the entire indefinite remainder of those story arcs in 1 issue. And no hate to the creative team at all, I'm sure they did their best with what they have, but what they had was a bad situation. And you can tell that it was a bad situation when you read it. So why do I bring this up? Why do I go on a whole tangent about an individual series in a video on Marvel's cosmology? Well, remember, a whole point of Gods was redefining that cosmology, and even though it was canceled very early, it did get 8 issues, And those 8 issues are still technically the most up-to-date canon on this stuff that we have. So what this means is that Gods has put the cosmology into a sort of unfinished, half-complete overhaul, and I don't really know what to do with that. On the one hand, the cosmology that they did get through is super cool, and I want to present it, plus it is genuinely the most recent canon that we have, so I can't just pretend that it doesn't exist. That wouldn't be accurate. But on the other hand, Marvel as a corporation really seems to not like Gods, and therefore I would not be surprised if some or all of this information gets retconned again relatively soon. But regardless of all that, now that I've mentioned that little disclaimer, which I did feel somewhat obligated to do in case this info changes, for the rest of this, I am going to treat Gods as if it is canon, because it is. Also, I happen to like the Gods lore, and if I can tell more people about it, then maybe Marvel will realize that people like it and not get rid of it. Please, Marvel, don't get rid of the Gods lore. Let more people write about it. Hell, let me write about it. I've got ideas in mind. So, with all of that said, now we get into one of my favorite parts of this video, the abstracts. This is where I get to start breaking out the charts and diagrams. We're in the deep lore now, people. The abstracts can be defined as cosmic entities which are the literal embodiments of things or concepts. This can sometimes be hard to wrap your head around, but it's easier with an example, and the easiest example is death. The being known as death is death in the most literal sense that I can possibly mean it. She is not an entity with control over death like the Greek god Thanatos, who is a god of death. She is death. She is a being that represents death as a concept. There are a bunch of these cosmic abstracts, and which ones are more or less important has varied over the years, but as of the 8th cosmos, there are fittingly 8 of them that are at the top of the heap, and death actually isn't one of them. These 8 beings are known as the Divisors, and they are divided into 4 opposite pairings. These pairings are Infinity and Eternity, who represent physical existence, typically characterized as space and time, Master Order and Lord Chaos, who should be obvious from the name, the Living Tribunal and Oblivion, who I can best describe as existence versus non-existence, though this is a little bit shakier, and these are the newest of the pairings and also the longest names, the Powers That Be, which represents magic as a concept, and the Natural Order of Things, which represents science as a concept. Those last 2 were introduced as part of the major overhaul that happened in Gods, the series, and thus they are the least defined, so we're going to start with them because that also makes them the easiest. These 2 entities, which for the sake of me not having to do a tongue twister every clip, I'm just going to refer to as the Powers and the Natural, hate each other with a burning passion. All of the other pairings get along at least somewhat, not these 2. As purely magical and purely scientific entities respectively, they both believe that the other is fundamentally wrong, and dislike each other so much that they will not work with each other directly, instead having mortals do it for them. For the Powers, this takes the form of a singular mortal who is given the title of the Avatar, and thus acts on the will of the Powers, making sure that everything is okay with the magical sphere in the mortal plane. The Natural, as you might expect from a science-based entity, does not leave its work to one singular mortal and instead employs a collective known as the Centum. The Centum is made up of 100 scientists, all each numbered 1 to 100. Agents of the Centum are called Centivars, and their rank is not determined purely by how high or low their number is. Instead, the highest ranking ones are the ones with prime number designations, which is a really cool little world-building nuance for a super science organization. See, this is the kind of detail that Gods tried to do. I'm so sad that Gods went away. It was such a fun idea, and now it's gone, and I could just rant about this for 10 more minutes, so I gotta move on. Unfortunately, that moving on does have to come really fast, because we don't have a lot more information about the Powers That Be or the natural order of things. As I said, Gods ended really fast, and they didn't get more development, but we can move on to the others who have been around longer. Although in the case of the next pair, Master Order and Lord Chaos, being around longer doesn't mean that there's a lot much more to talk about. These 2 are pretty simple. They do have one really cool storyline from recent years that I will definitely cover in a minute, but before we get to that, we have to go over their base information. Master Order is the cosmic embodiment of order. Lord Chaos is the cosmic embodiment of chaos. Sometimes, if a story needs one of these type of roles to be filled, they will show up. And the basics are done. That's all they are. Despite the fact that these 2 are not that complex on their own, we can use them to introduce some new concepts to the cosmology that we haven't talked about yet, the first one being the intermediaries. Remember that this group of cosmic entities is divided into 4 opposite pairs, and 3 out of 4 of those pairs work with lesser entities who act as mediators between them. The science and magic entities that we discussed a couple minutes ago are the exception pair that doesn't have one, simply because these 2 cosmic beings hate each other so much that there would be no point to an intermediary at all. Even if they had one, they still could not work together. For Master Order and Lord Chaos, their intermediary is the being known as the In-Betweener, which, yeah, I mean, that name does make sense. He'd do be in between things. Technically, the In-Betweener is not just representative of the balance between order and chaos, he's also been said to function as the concept of duality and balance between all opposing opposite concepts, but usually in modern canon, it's the order and chaos thing, which is also the springboard for that cool storyline that I mentioned. We're going to tie together a couple concepts from earlier in this video now. Remember how I mentioned that Galactus, as the Devourer of Worlds, has an insatiable cosmic hunger, but that it has been removed from him on a few occasions? During one of these cases, Order and Chaos were very mad about this status quo change. This comic happened shortly after the 2015 Secret Wars event, which was again when the universe was forcibly reset, going from Cosmos number 7 to Cosmos number 8. While this was not a full reboot, the cosmic hierarchy of things changed, and this is one of the reasons Galactus was allowed to shift. When Galactus's hunger was inverted and he was transformed into the Life-Bringer, several cosmic entities convened to see whether he could stay like that or would need to be changed back, and the Living Tribunal, who we haven't talked about yet but will in a minute, ruled in favor of him. The reasoning behind this decision was that reality was technically new at the time, and even though the cosmic entities present were mostly the same, their hierarchy and roles within the system could shift around. Order and Chaos did not like this, but took it to heart and basically said, hey, if you're gonna decide that things can be different, why don't we become stronger now? Thus, to impose their will upon reality and basically beat Galactus back into his place, Order and Chaos went to the In-Betweener and forced him to use his neutral power to unify the pair, fusing Order and Chaos into a new cosmic entity known as Logos, the embodiment of law. Logos looked very cool, lots of angelic imagery and symbolism going on here, and he also messed up everything, fighting cosmic entities, killing all of the Celestials, the Maker got involved briefly, and things spiraled so much that a bunch of superheroes from Earth had to go deal with him, as these things usually end up in one way or another. But Sir Superhero, I hear you asking, how do a bunch of superheroes from Earth defeat a cosmic embodiment of law? Well, A, they do this kind of thing all the time, technically, and B, in this specific case, Black Panther beat him by basically pulling rank on God? T'Challa does some cool magic stuff, ascends to this cosmic ethereal realm to deal with the threat directly, and since Wakanda is a very magical spiritual place, as king, T'Challa has some level of jurisdiction here. So he basically says, hey, Logos, I am a king, you are law incarnate. Kings define law, therefore you have to do what I say, and yeah, this works. It sounds wild at first, and I guess it is wild, but it does make sense when you think about it. Logos as a being was never meant to exist. It was meant to be these separate balancing entities. When they unified, their balance was thrown off, and that left loopholes in their system, which T'Challa was able to exploit. And he basically just told them, okay, no more of this unification, split up again and make everything okay, and they had to listen to him. So Master Order, Lord Chaos, and the In-Betweener returned to their old status quo, and that's where they've been ever since. But with this pairing, I do get to introduce another concept, that being the redesigns that the Gods series introduced. For the vast majority of Marvel history, the physical appearances of the cosmic entities kind of just looked like people. Weird people, sure, sometimes full bodies, sometimes just floating heads, but they altogether looked surprisingly normal for abstract entities. Gods looked at that and said, why? Why can't we make them weird? They should be weird, let's do that. So now we have several new interpretations of what these cosmic beings quote-unquote actually look like. In the case of Master Order, he's not just a floating human face anymore. In his true form, he is an infinitely tall pillar. Of course, an infinitely tall pillar is not the most practical for a lot of situations, as cool and thematic as it might be, so if Order ever needs to take a human form, he can do that in a way that resembles a monk. The true form of Lord Chaos is, as you'd expect, quite different. It is not a strict, rigid pillar. Instead, it is a mass of almost fabric-like shifting cosmic material. Its human form is also far less consistent, but it most typically appears as a woman with very large black eyes whose clothing changes constantly. Actually, if you take a look at the artist notes here, it explicitly says that the avatar should wear a different dress in every panel, which is cool symbolism, and also by comic book timescales means that the clothes change like every couple of seconds. Now we move on to the next Ur-Divisor pair, that being Oblivion and the Living Tribunal, representing roughly non-existence versus existence. We're gonna start with Oblivion because Oblivion's lore is really weird and changes very fast, and so it's gonna be kinda hard to talk about, therefore I'm just gonna try and speedrun it here. Oblivion represents primordial nothingness and arose from the void before creation itself. This does mean that he predates the multiverse as it stands, and in fact quite possibly comes from before several Cosmos iterations, though I don't believe we know exactly when he originated. Oblivion is an ultimate nihilist. He wants the universe to be destroyed so that he can return to his non-existent void, and typically just waits around for that to happen. Occasionally he takes actions to speed up the destruction of reality, but not nearly as much as you might think. This entity also has a very close relationship with another cosmic abstract, that being death. Oblivion has both referred to death as a sibling and as a daughter, depending on the comic, which sounds really weird, but remember, these are cosmic entities, they don't really follow human relationship conventions, they're not like dating or anything, they just view each other as family, and it's kind of hard to describe exactly how that works. Oblivion also has several other quote-unquote children, including the monster known as the Chaos King, and potentially the Anti-All from the third Cosmos, and Null, god of the symbiotes from later Cosmos, though these last two are theories and likely but not 100% confirmed. Here's the problem. I see people hyping up Oblivion sometimes as a very powerful being within Marvel, which he is. He did exist, quote-unquote, before existence itself, but Oblivion isn't exactly handled in the way that you might think he is. He's only appeared in about 25 comics at the time of this recording, and a bunch of those are parody. Oblivion is a recurring figure in the Great Lakes Avengers because the member of the team named Doorman is technically Oblivion's avatar. And no, this is not played as a big, scary, intimidating thing. It's played as a joke because it is in fact a joke. And this is not even really that new. It took a very long time for Oblivion to be treated as a serious cosmic entity. When he first debuted, it was not in a parody series, but it certainly was not in a series that heavily deals with magic things. In fact, it's such a weird pull that I want you guys to guess, so we're gonna do audience participation again. You get 3 guesses. You know what? Hell, 5 guesses. That's how unlikely I think it is. Your hint is that it is a solo character series, and the name of the series is just the title of that character. You can put this in the comments if you want, or you can just do it in your head. Whatever, I don't care. But pause the video now and think about this if you want to play the game. You ready? Okay, here we go. Oblivion, cosmic embodiment of the concept of nothingness itself, first debuted in 1985 as a major character in an Iceman series. Bobby Drake, Iceman of the X-Men, is the first time we see Oblivion. And seriously, I do mean major character. This was a 4-issue Iceman miniseries. Oblivion was the primary antagonist of not just one issue, but the whole thing. And then he only appeared 20 more times from there, most of which have been recent. Most of those recent appearances were in Gods. To no one's surprise, I'm sure, Gods really is the thing that defines all of the cosmology, and I'm going to keep coming back to it and keep being sad about it so many more times in this video. Oblivion is not really a villain in Gods, though, at least not in the way that you think he is. He is kind of a setup and tease for other things that never really come to pass. A lot of the storyline of Gods does deal with a looming apocalypse, and Oblivion is just chilling, waiting for it to happen, and getting mad when people are intervening in it. He does get a redesign as this weird eldritch cosmic snake thing, and his human form is just a guy. Like a kinda shabby looking guy, which yeah, he's an ultimate nihilist. Why would he try to look cool? He's just waiting for everything to go away. This does make sense. Now, the other reason why I say Oblivion's lore is weird and kind of hard to talk about right now is that it is changing currently. Marvel does not stop publishing books when I decide to do a lore breakdown of stuff, and they shouldn't. I'm not claiming that they should, but yeah, as of this recording, a new comic came out 2 days ago that is shifting Oblivion's status quo once more. This would be the current Storm series. Yes, Storm is doing a whole lot of cosmic stuff right now, and in this series, Oblivion is getting impatient and trying to accelerate the destruction of reality again, and the Living Tribunal is attempting to stop him. Their conflict is right now actively ongoing, and I don't know how it ends because that comic has not been published yet. So just understand that if you're watching this in the future, Oblivion's fate in current canon might be a little bit different, but this is good at least up until February 2025. And now we segue nicely into the Living Tribunal. Oh man, I don't even know how I'm gonna do this section in any timely manner. If you thought Oblivion was a whole thing, the Living Tribunal is, very fittingly, about 3 times more of a whole thing. Though maybe a better joke would be saying that it is 6 times more of a whole thing, because there are actually 2 Living Tribunals, and this is the main reason why their history is so incredibly complicated. First off, let's get the basic information out of the way that applies to both iterations of this being. The Living Tribunal often functions as a judge, specifically a judge between cosmic entities whenever they have disputes regarding each other. The 3 faces of the tribunal represent 3 facets of justice, in order being equity, vengeance, and necessity, but don't make the mistake of thinking that these make the tribunal a good entity per se. Its job is making sure that no singular thing overrides everything else. This means that the tribunal can be invoked if evil has an overwhelming presence within existence, but if good ever got an overwhelming presence, the tribunal would rule against it equally. If you're wondering what the threshold is for that kind of thing and thinking of a what-if comic that is overwhelmingly evil or good, an important concept to note is that the Tribunal is a truly multiversal entity. Actually, Oblivion was as well, but I forgot to mention it during that section and don't want to redo it. Yeah, though, the Living Tribunal and Oblivion are singular concepts across the multiverse. The Tribunal is powerful enough to appear in multiple universes at once, but all of them go back to the same being, and typically, it really only cares about existence at a multiversal level. If one singular universe is imbalanced and that's not going to spread to others, that's not the Tribunal's business and will leave it to lesser entities. The singular nature of the Tribunal is, kind of paradoxically, the reason why there are 2 of them, because the original Tribunal did get murdered by the Beyonders. So many concepts looping back in, but hey, that's how cosmology works, so let's return to that Beyonders thing from a while ago. Remember how the Beyonders are from a very, very old universe, and they wanted to destroy the current universe because they saw a bad fate and decided to unplug it and plug it back in? The Tribunal wasn't going to let them do that, so they had to kill the Tribunal first, and that's exactly what they did. Then, the Beyonders did their plan, Dr. Doom hijacked their plan, the universe came back as Cosmos number 8, Secret Wars stuff that we've already gone over. But there was no Living Tribunal because it was dead, and that was separate from the destruction of the universe. It had been killed before that, and so it did not get reborn. And then in one of the weirdest little plot lines to happen in quite a while, an alternate universe variant of Adam Warlock and Thanos ended up traveling so high in the cosmic hierarchy that they got to talk with the writers of Marvel Comics in the form of the being known as the One Above All, who again we will talk about later, and through a deal that was struck there, that Adam Warlock variant became the new Living Tribunal at a multiversal level. What is the functional difference between the old murdered tribunal and the new Adam Warlock tribunal? Nothing, basically. The new one pretty much acts the exact same way that the old one did. This is just one of those things that I had to mention. But for practical purposes, yeah, this story doesn't matter. There is a Living Tribunal again, and he is the same as the old one. Of course, the Living Tribunal did get a redesign in Gods, and a very cool one. This is what the true form looks like, and as you can probably expect if you know anything about my tastes, I absolutely love it, and its human form, as again you might expect, was actually 3 human forms that always stood really close to each other. Cool as I think this form was, it didn't really stick like some of the other Gods redesigns did. After all, the Living Tribunal did have a somewhat iconic look before this, as simple as it was, and so he still usually appears in that form after Gods, although I guess technically this is another form that we could see him in at any time. Though I will also put the caveat on this that the Living Tribunal's status quo is evolving very fast. He is also important in the ongoing Storm series that released a comic, like I said, 2 days ago, so this is accurate, once again, as of February 2025, but could change very rapidly. Before we move on to the final pair, though, we should briefly address Oblivion and the Tribunal's intermediary, an entity known as the Preordained. This entity doesn't have a lot of development to it. The actual idea of intermediaries was introduced in, say it with me now, Gods, and so some of them are very new. The in-betweener for Lord Order and Master Chaos, that's not which one is which. I've had to record that so many times because I keep mixing up their titles. At this point, I'm just gonna leave it in, who cares? Point is, the in-betweener is old, he's been around for decades, and Gods was the book which decided that other pairs might also have intermediaries, so the preordained was introduced in that and then never explored upon because Gods didn't get the time to do that. Now, the final pair of Divisors, Infinity and Eternity. They are not the most powerful of them per se, that would still be the Tribunal, but there's a reason I cover them last, and it's because they have the most important lore, which will lead into the next sections. If you only knew about one of these cosmic entities going into this video, chances are it was probably Eternity, because he is the only one that's actually been a plot point within the MCU. Yes, a few of the others have been referenced or seen briefly, but Eternity is the only one that actually matters to a story. While the other three pairs of Divisors represent metaphysical concepts, Eternity and Infinity represent hard physical concepts, that being the universe itself in the most literal sense. As a pair, Eternity represents time, while Infinity represents space, though as physics nerds are going to be very happy to hear, the line between these is way more blurred than the other pairings. Space, time, they are very connected, and this pairing acknowledges that. Their separation is far less defined. Since they are so connected, I'm going to treat them more like one entity rather than splitting them into two sections like I have for the other pairs. This is also because Eternity has appeared in about 4 times more comics than Infinity has, and therefore his lore is way more developed, but in theory, they should work the same, so I'm just going to assume that they do because that makes sense. Eternity and Infinity are multiversal entities, but in a bit more weird and nuanced way than the others are. There is an Eternity and probably an Infinity for each individual universe, not at a multiversal scale, but all of those are like individual pieces of a larger being known as multiversal Eternity and probably multiversal Infinity. Eternity also has several children, most of which are concepts of physical space or time. A lot of them are one-off jokes, and I'll just put them up on the screen rather than taking the time to go through them one by one, but we will spend a minute on the ones that matter. My favorite of Eternity's children are named Then and Now, representing past and present respectively. These two are the canon reason why time in comic books is often so screwy. Then and Now like superheroes, and they want superheroes to have more adventures. Thus, they screw with time, making it not operate in a purely linear fashion. This is the explanation for why sometimes characters are appearing in more than one series at once, and why those timelines don't perfectly line up. It's not just a factor of the publication. I mean, it absolutely is that, but in universe, it is these cosmic kids who want to read more comic books. Another one of Eternity's important children is the entity known as Eon, who was later killed and succeeded by his daughter Epic. To be clear, E-P-O-C-H, not E-P-I-C. Eon and Epic are very weird, and their role within the cosmic scale of things has never been defined super well. They are important, but only important to very specific characters like Quasar, and therefore kind of difficult to explain and tangential to this video. So I'm just gonna do the cop-out answer and put some info about them in a text box on the screen. If you want to read about it, you can do so now. Otherwise, don't really worry about it. They're not gonna be super relevant for the rest of the video. Getting back to Infinity and Eternity, of course the pair got redesigns in Gods. They weren't super important to the course of the story, but they got these cosmic armor looks regardless. Their human forms are also the most human passing out of the group. And their intermediary is a being named Continuum, who, like the Preordained, never really got explained, but this is what it looks like. Beyond these visuals, the actual role of Eternity as a quote-unquote character is typically quite straightforward. The whole granting wishes thing from Thor Love and Thunder, yeah, that was something the MCU entirely made up. Comics Eternity has never been about that. In the comics, it is simply the embodiment of the universe as a conscious entity. Though maybe simply was the wrong word there, but I think it's relatively easy to understand. This whole existential consciousness thing is the reason why I put these pair last in the order of the Divisors. If you think back all the way to Act 1 of this video, you might recall that I mentioned the idea of existence having a consciousness in a few different cosmos. In the first cosmos, we had the first firmament, who was lonely and created the Celestials for companionship. Then the second cosmos killed itself, and then the other ones from there also had their own sentience, which I didn't go into in detail because we don't know too much about them. Eternity is the equivalent of this for the current cosmos. Each of the cosmos has had a consciousness, and whatever happened to the cosmos, they are all around in some form. Yes, some of them died or otherwise ceased to exist, but come on, this is weird comic book, pseudo-religious, science, magic, cosmic, whatever. It's reasonable that they could come back, right? Reasonable-ish. In this image, you can see the sentient beings that represent every cosmos all together. This picture right here is the reason that I organized this cosmology video in the act structure that I did. I had to talk about the history first so that we could understand what I meant by this part. For the few of you that definitely paused to look at that image a little bit closer, you might notice that the first firmament, the embodiment of the first cosmos, is not listed here with all the others. It is still around, but it is super evil and definitely a villain. Once again, I'm going to call back to Act 1. As a brief refresher, the first cosmos was just the concept of existence, and then it was shattered into the second cosmos, which introduced the multiverse. The keyword is shattered. It did not cease to exist, it just got broken, and part of it survived. Then, in the Ultimates run of 2016, which by the way is where a huge chunk of this cosmology lore comes from, if you want to read this in the stories, go check this one out, it returned, and it was very, very mad that it had been replaced. Look, I'll just say it this way. The point of this video is not power scaling, and we are going to address that topic a little bit more, but if you want to talk power scaling, the first firmament is one that you can bring to arguments if you want to break people's brains. The first firmament is the first existence in every sense of the word. It is so strong that it was able to beat and absorb the eternity of the eighth cosmos. And I don't mean just a singular eternity, I mean the multiversal eternity. First firmament is powerful enough to just absorb multiverses if it wants. This shot from a couple minutes ago of all the other cosmos sentiences coming together, the reason that they're all in the same place is that it took all of them working as a unit to beat first firmament. 6 multiverses. It took the combined might of 6 multiverses to not even destroy, but just weaken and then trap the first firmament so that it could be contained. It's not just God, it is primordial pre-multiverse God. And actually, it's not just primordial pre-multiverse God, it is primordial pre-multiverse God. You know what? If I'm gonna do this bit, I might as well fully commit. It is primordial pre-multiverse God. Yeah, that sounds right. With these cosmic embodiments addressed at least quickly, surely we're getting to the end of Act 2 of this video, right? Like, how much farther can we go? And yes, we are getting to the end, but there's a few more that I should address at least briefly before we move on to Act 3. Phoenix Force, definitely need to bring that one up. Weirdly, the Phoenix Force is actually not as complicated as you might think. This is a strange nuance, but the storylines that involve the Phoenix Force are very complex, but the entity itself is pretty simple. The Phoenix Force is life force. It is the collective psionic energy that powers all life throughout the multiverse. And yes, I said multiverse on this one, there is only one Phoenix Force with aspects in each individual universe. Like many of the other cosmic entities, the Phoenix Force cannot be considered truly good or evil. I guess you could put it roughly on the good side because it is the embodiment of life, but it is life that is unbound and unbalanced, and if nothing is keeping the Phoenix Force in check, that can also be extremely dangerous. Since it is a being revolving around life, it often bonds with living hosts, the most notable of these being obviously Jean Grey. However, when the Phoenix Force bonds with a host, this can actually be a kind of bad thing because it can lead to it being corrupted. The reason that we get Dark Phoenix and things like that is because this cosmic embodiment of life is bonding directly with a human mind, and that is a two-way street. The emotions that are present in a human mind can be projected onto the Phoenix Force as a whole, and as a cosmic entity, it's not really supposed to have human emotions, which can throw it all out of whack and lead to bad stuff. A far less important entity, but one that is still definitely worthy of getting his own section, is, long name here, Anthropomorpho, Prime Manifester of the Manifestations. Anthropomorpho is the leader of actually a group of entities known simply as the Manifestations, and their role is a very simple but very important one. They make the bodies that you see cosmic entities appear in. After all, who determines what the embodiment of space or time or chaos or order is going to look like? There's an answer to that, and it's Anthropomorpho. Anthropomorpho itself looks like this, and the reason that he makes these things, known as M-bodies, is basically just for the convenience of everybody involved, because it is much easier for everyone to understand things when these cosmic abstracts can have physical form. Tragically, Anthropomorpho is never addressed. He only appeared in 3 issues of a Quasar comic in 1992 and has never been seen since, but he also technically hasn't been retconned, and so I'm going to choose to believe that he is still the explanation for the physical forms. In fact, I will take it one step further and say that I'm going to headcanon he is why the beings looked different in Gods. There was a new universe reset and they wanted new looks, and so Anthropomorpho basically was a cosmic tailor and made them new, more abstract, weird-looking bodies to inhabit. Just to be clear, that is not canon at all, but I'm going to pretend it is, and I think you should do the same. Now, as we really do come to the end of Act 2, I will reiterate something that I said earlier, which is that this is only a small scattering of many, many cosmic entities that act on the multiverse. I chose who to include in this section based on who is most important to the cosmology in the current state of things, but there are many more. Master Hate and Mistress Love, the Stranger, Abraxas. Cosmic entities pop up here and there all the time, but most of them don't actually have real ramifications on the storyline, even if their cosmic role is stated to be important. Abraxas is a good example, so I will quickly touch on him just to prove my point. Abraxas is an entity of destruction. He wanted to bring about the non-existence of the multiverse, much like a lot of other cosmic entities. He swept through realities, killing a bunch of Galactus variants, eventually ended up on Earth 616, messed with the Fantastic Four and Franklin Richards, a lot of fancy stuff, to the point where Abraxas is stated to be the antithesis to the very act of creation, which sounds very fancy. Here's the thing, he's only in 5 issues of the Fantastic Four ever, and then he dies because he got killed by the Ultimate Nullifier, so I'm not going to devote a lot of time to him because even though they say he's important, he's clearly not. This kind of thing happens all the time, and I do get why, I guess. Ultimately, it is pretty easy for a writer to just come up with a new evil cosmic entity, use them for an arc or two, and then discard them, which leads to a lot of canon but irrelevant cosmic entities just floating around with their status unconfirmed. So yeah, there are a bunch more cosmic entities that appear in 1 or 2 different comics, but I've talked about the ones that matter the most, and we will leave the others to their own devices. But what about the cosmic entities that don't exist? At least not in the traditional sense. We're done with Act 2 of the video, but now it's time for the secret Act -2, the Queen of Nevers. As we have established, eternity is the consciousness of the universe. It is the sentient embodiment of everything that is. As a counterpart to that, the Queen of Nevers is the sentient embodiment of everything that isn't. The reason that I have separated this into Act -2 is that things are going to get real trippy for the next couple of minutes, and they've been trippy for the last hour, so buckle up. The Queen of Nevers did not start existence, or non-existence, or whatever, as the Queen of Nevers. She dates all the way back to the 4th cosmos. In fact, she was the 4th cosmos. We have established at this point that every iteration of reality has its own sentience, be that the first firmament, or eternity, or any of the ones in between, and the 4th cosmos was embodied by an entity known as the Pilgrim. Much like the other cosmic embodiments, he was everything. The Pilgrim was a representation of the universe and everything contained within in all of its forms. But rather than dying or fading away or leaving like the other cosmos typically do when their universe cycle is up, he stuck around and changed forms. The Pilgrim evolved, becoming the Queen of Nevers, an embodiment of things that do not exist, but not in a nihilistic or negative way like Oblivion. Rather, the Queen of Nevers is the embodiment of possibility as a counterpart to eternity. If eternity represents what is, the Queen of Nevers represents what could be. She has her own little pocket dimension outside of existence known as the Land of Couldn't Be, Shouldn't Be, and while the Queen of Nevers can manifest in physical space, she has been advised not to by Eternity and listens to him because Eternity and the Queen of Nevers are lovers. Yes, it is cosmic canon in the Marvel Universe that the concept of existence and the concept of possibility are dating, which is stupid and I love it. There is another member of this trio as well, not in the romantic sense, it's not a love triangle, but in the cosmic representation triangle, and that is a being known as the Griever at the end of all things, typically just called the Griever. The Griever has stated that she is an embodiment of entropy and will eventually see the breakdown of the universe, which is her ultimate goal. Now, there have been several entities which have called themselves the embodiment of entropy before, but it seems like in the current canon, the Griever is the main or real one. It's important to note that she is not like Oblivion, where she is a representation of nothingness. She represents the breakdown of reality, not the non-existence of reality, which is a weird but important distinction. Together, the trio of Eternity, the Griever, and the Queen of Nevers represent respectively what is, what will be, and what could be, though this is a less balanced relationship because the Griever's vision is often seen as evil. This relationship is very relevant to current Scarlet Witch comics especially, which have confirmed that Wanda Maximoff is an agent of the Queen of Nevers, and that her power is one that can defeat the Griever's ultimate goals. There's a whole complicated backstory to this, but basically Wanda's powers mess with chaos and probability, and it's been stated by the Queen of Nevers that if she ever reaches her full potential, she could reverse the physical process of entropy at a multiversal scale, ensuring that the Griever's ultimate destruction does not come to pass. Also, I'm just going to address this real quick here because I know it's one of those things people will bring up if I don't. I'm going to disappoint some people here. This does not mean that Scarlet Witch is like the most powerful being in the entire multiverse. This is a weirdly common misconception, and it's because of a couple comics, which I will put on the screen here, that reference something called the Grand Design. This has been misinterpreted by people as the One Above All's Grand Design. Again, we'll talk about the One Above All in a second, but it's definitely not that. The Grand Design in this case is referring to entropy. It is talking about the Griever's design and how if she gets her way, then everything in the universe will break down and decay. The reason that I know this is the Griever's design and not anything else is that it has been explicitly stated to be the Griever's design on several occasions, which I will also now put up on the screen. The One Above All is never mentioned in these books, so I really don't know how this misconception arose, but yeah, it's definitely referring to the Griever specifically. And now with the Queen of Nevers addressed, Act -2 is over and we can get to the third and final act of this Cosmology video, the structure of the multiverse. A map of it, if you will. Though map in the traditional sense is definitely wrong because this is going to be strange and weird and twisty, exactly as it should be. Let's get started. We're going to begin our adventure at human scale, and where better to start a journey through the Marvel Multiverse than in New York City, specifically 177A Bleecker Street, the address of the Sanctum Sanctorum. We're gonna walk right in, say hi to Strange, Clea, Wong, and Bats the Ghost Dog, then take a peek inside the Orb of Agamotto and see some very weird places. But we're not going to start by going up, we're going to start by going down. If you shrink yourself down enough from human scale, you will end up in the realm known as the Microverse or the Quantum Realm. Either name is equally correct, the MCU just had to change it for legal reasons. I'm gonna say Microverse because it's what's used more often in the comics, but both are right. The exact canon status of the Microverse is a little bit shaky because it's been retconned a few times, leading to the most simple fact about it being weirdly up for debate. Is the Microverse actually small or not? Originally, the Microverse was just tiny. It was a layer of reality where everything was so small that humans couldn't interact with it. But if you got yourself small enough, abracadabra, now you were on the same scale as everything else there and you could interact with it. And then this was changed. I'm not really sure why that was changed, but it was. Current Microverse canon says that the Microverse is not tiny in a literal sense, it's just a parallel dimension that you access by getting really small, and once you do that enough, your body creates this weird little dimensional nexus, and the energy from that, just all the compression of matter, sends you over into the Microverse. I'm pretty sure that that is the current state of how you access the Microverse. Not 100% sure, I'll be very honest, but either way, it is close enough, you get small and you end up there. Functionally, visiting the Microverse is just kind of like going to a different galaxy. It's not an alternate universe where there are variants of people you know, it is a different dimension with its own planets and people and cultures. There seems to be a different Microverse for each individual universe. It is not one Microverse that the entire multiverse has to share, but I say seems to be because, as you can probably guess from how I've been describing it, the canon of the Microverse is a little bit weird. We aren't going to spend too much time here though, because we have to keep shrinking downwards. Get even smaller than Microversal scale, and you're going to end up in a far weirder, but also I guess far less interesting area known as Underspace. Underspace is basically just a void. It is where you end up when you get so small that the conventions of space don't really apply to you. There's nothing here, that's why I say it's not interesting. But you can build stuff here, which is the only reason that we've actually seen it in a comic. Hank Pym used Pym particles to create the Infinite Avengers Mansion in the Underspace once, which is basically like Avengers Mansion combined with a TARDIS. That's the easiest way I can describe it. Underspace is the smallest that you can get. What happens if you try to shrink down more here? I have absolutely no idea, and physics don't apply, so there's probably not a consistent answer. As for the question of whether there are multiple underspaces or just one collective one for the entire multiverse, I have absolutely no idea. I am inclined to say that there is an individual underspace per universe for reasons that I will get to later, but there's not a solid answer to that. Honestly, the underspace is not important, and it's a miracle that I remembered to include it in this video at all. So we have zoomed in on reality 2 layers deep and hit the end of our journey in that direction. Now let's go back to human scale and start zooming outwards. The next part of this is really easy. You zoom out from the orb of Agamotto, and you're in the Sanctum, which is in New York, which is on Earth, which is in the solar system, which is in the Milky Way, which is in the universe. I don't really have to explain how that works. It's more or less the same as the real world, and it doesn't start getting funky until you get bigger from there. Though before we get to the actual multiverse, we need to address different dimensions. Now, in a different video on this channel, I described dimensions versus universes in a slightly different way than I'm going to here, so if you've seen my Captain Britain video, what I said there is not technically wrong, but take this as the more in-depth explanation since this is what the main purpose of the video is about. Dimension can and does mean many, many things, but you can roughly categorize them into terms that I made up, which are parallel dimensions and multiversal dimensions. Let's address parallel dimensions first. The easiest example of a parallel dimension is simply hell. I mean, where is hell in a physical sense? It's not somewhere that you can fly to, no matter how good your spaceship is. You're gonna have to cross some sort of metaphysical barrier to get there. This same sort of logic also applies to regions like the astral plane or the dark dimension from Doctor Strange to a certain extent, areas that are specific to each universe, but are definitely not on the same level of existence as the physical realm. Are we going to be going through every parallel dimension that exists within the Marvel Universe? No. Absolutely not, because there are about 1 billion of them. Even using hell as an example is a cop-out because there are a lot of different areas that could be considered hell. Remember how at the end of Act 2 I said that it was ultimately very easy for a writer to just make up a cosmic entity, use them for an arc or two, and then abandon them? Yeah, same thing applies to parallel dimensions. There absolutely are parallel dimensions which are very important. Asgard is often represented as a parallel dimension, though the lines there are a little bit fuzzy, but for every Asgard you have a lot that are named things like Heislip, or the Purple Dimension, or Acid Rain World, or nonsense like that never matter. So suffice it to say, for our sort of multiversal mapping purposes, every individual universe has a varying number of different layers of existence within it, which we will refer to as parallel dimensions. Now let's zoom out even further and get to multiverse stuff. At this point, I should remind everybody that each individual universe within the Marvel Multiverse has a number. The main universe in which almost everything goes on is referred to as Earth 616, and as we zoom out of Earth 616, before we get to other universes, we're going to reach a middle state called the superflow. The superflow is the connecting quote-unquote space between multiverses. Obviously, that does not work in a literal physical spatial sense. This is all very weird esoteric stuff, and there's not a lot of natural matter there, but there is a lot of energy, especially of the psionic variety. The canon of this is a little bit shaky, but it has been stated before that the superflow is where dreams come from, and also that it is an origin for telepathy. I guess when telepaths are reaching out to other minds, they are doing so through the superflow somehow. If you manage to directly enter the superflow somehow, you will find the occasional structure there. There is matter there. The keyword to what I said a minute ago was that there is not a lot of natural matter. Certain extremely advanced groups, especially the alien race known as the Builders, have built what are basically space stations within the superflow nearby specific universes. This is also the area that the first Firmament and his minions were chilling as they were waiting to destroy all of reality. The superflow is very cool as a concept, but we're not going to spend a lot of time here on our journey either, mostly because there's not much here to talk about. So we zoom out just a little bit further, and we finally reach the multiverse as it is typically understood. The first thing that you're going to see here is alternate universes. And honestly, at this point, if you've gotten an hour and 20 minutes almost into this video, I really hope I don't have to explain the general idea of what an alternate universe is to you. The important thing to note when we're talking about the multiverse of Marvel Comics is that not all of these alternate universes are direct branches of a singular timeline. That's the way the MCU has tried to characterize it, and it kind of makes sense for what they're doing, but the comics have never stuck too strictly to that. Some of them are timeline branches, but a lot of them just exist without a solid explanation as to why they exist. And honestly, I prefer this. Counterintuitive to the whole point of this video, I do think that the multiverse is an idea that should not be over-explained. It's better when it's just comic book nonsense, there's a multiverse, and not every universe has to have an in-depth history. Now, we're not nearly done zooming out. There's a lot more quote-unquote higher levels that we need to hit here, but we can't leave the multiverse just yet because I do have to explain the concept of multiversal dimensions that I mentioned earlier. Some realities within the multiverse do not have variants of themselves. They are one existence, and there's nothing else out there that's exactly like they are. This is what I call a multiversal dimension, though I should be very clear, that is my term for it. I don't believe there's an official name for this. A good example of this would be Mojo World, home of the X-Men villain Mojo, which exists in a singular dimension known as the Mojoverse. As you can tell, there's a theme with their naming. There is only one Mojo and only one Mojo World. If the X-Men are going there, they are leaving their universe and going to this different one. And if the X-Men of a different reality were to go to the Mojoverse, they would end up in the same one, not their own version of it. Some of these dimensions exist in a unique space within the structure of the multiverse, leading to them having the title Nexus of All Realities. One of the easiest examples of this is the dimension known as Otherworld. Just with the way that Otherworld is positioned in relation to everywhere else, the cosmic energies of the multiverse, probably through the superflow, happen to concentrate in this area, allowing Otherworld to be a focal point by which one person can travel to any other area. Nexi don't have to be entire dimensions either. There can be nexi within individual realities. The Everglades is one in the main Marvel universe. They can also be housed within items like the Macron crystal, which pretty much works like a nexus, and also they can be individual beings. The best example of this is the Scarlet Witch, who draws a lot of her power from the fact that she is a Nexus being. In fact, the Queen of Nevers uses Nexus beings as her agents. They are the ones who enact possibility throughout the multiverse. With all of this established, let's zoom out a little bit more, not enough to take us into the next zone, but enough that we can kind of recap what we've seen so far. Looking down, we see a vast network of alternate universes and singular multiversal dimensions, held together by a structure known as the superflow, consisting of cosmic energy which converges at various types of nexus points. This is the multiverse. This is also eternity. What we are looking at right now is what the cosmic entity known as eternity embodies. In fact, actually, hang on, let me zoom out like a couple clicks more here and oh, hello, it is eternity. This is eternity in a literal sense. By zooming out just a tiny little bit, we have entered another layer known as the overspace. As you might be able to guess, this is the opposite of the underspace, and it is somewhere that you can access by getting really, really big. This is not a place that gets accessed very often, but essentially, if you get big enough, then you are the size of the universe, and in this weird pseudo-religious cosmological sense, the universe is a guy, so if you're the same size as the guy, then you can talk to the guy. Once we have reached this level, we have officially exited the multiverse. Look, there he is right over there. And when we hit this level, it gets a little bit hard to tell exactly where things are in relation to each other because we're outside of space, and so terms like in relation don't have any meaning. This is where things get really cool though. Once we've exited the multiverse, all of the rules of logic that we've been using can be thrown out and things can be wild with no restrictions. However, before we get to these really wild realms, I do have to address an elephant in the room, the MCU. I have referenced it briefly a few times and now I'm actually gonna talk about it. As of now, when I am recording this video, the Marvel movies and the Marvel comics do not share any lore or canon connection. Of course, as of now in that sentence is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Maybe that will change in the future when the Secret Wars movie or something comes out. But when I'm recording this, they are unconnected entirely. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is an adaptation of the Marvel Comics. Just like Harry Potter or Percy Jackson or any other book that's made its way to screen, the two are not connected, it's just retellings of the same stories. I have seen this debate spiral into fights before, so I'm going to give some solid canon information on it, and then we'll get back to multiverse structure very soon, I promise, but I do think this is worth talking about. Many years ago, Marvel published a singular guidebook which made an offhand reference to the MCU as Earth 199999. This book came out in 2008, long before the Marvel Cinematic Universe started doing anything multiverse related. Back then, it was canon to the Marvel Multiverse, but in a way that didn't really affect anything. The comics and the movies were totally separate, but eventually, the movies started doing multiverse things too. At this point, the movies decided that they didn't want to be tied to the comics anymore and wanted to be able to do multiverse things more freely, so they started being treated like an adaptation. It was a retcon. Yes, it was a retcon, but retcons happen in comics all the time, and honestly, this was a pretty safe one because the comics and the movies hadn't affected each other. It really just removed one offhand Easter egg from a guidebook from 2008, and little else. But then, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness referred to the MCU main universe as number 616, and people started losing their minds about it. Here's the thing though, the movie multiverse and the comics multiverse are like really obviously unconnected. because both the comics and the movies have had multiverse spanning events that don't affect the other one. Plus, the cosmology of them has been described in entirely different ways on multiple occasions. Try to reconcile the canon I've been giving you in this video with the canon of the Loki show. You can't do it. They are incompatible with one another because they are different. If you want more solid proof than that, the MCU version of America Chavez has been confirmed as a singular entity within the multiverse. So she can't be in the same multiverse as the comics one because then there would be two of them. There's a lot of little things like this that make the lack of connection pretty clear, but I've already gone on this tangent for way too long, so we're gonna get back to the main topic. For now though, as we move outside of the comics multiverse, just understand that the movie multiverse and the comics multiverse are unconnected as of now. Trust me on that. Okay, I am adding another section to this real quickly. For me right now, it is literally hours before this video goes out, but I decided that I did need to briefly address the currently running TVA comic. This comic is causing a lot of confusion right now because it really looks like it is set inside the MCU version of the TVA. Characters original to the Loki show are appearing in it, it has the MCU TVA aesthetics, which we'd never seen before, and it explicitly references MCU events. If that was the end of it, it would not be that tough. It could just be an MCU tie-in comic, not connected to the rest of the comics, but no, it is also directly connected to the main comic book multiverse, and no explanation has been provided for this, leaving fans guessing. Now, Marvel has said there will be more answers to this within the issues that have not yet released, but thank goodness, there is actually a definitive answer to its canon status right now that I can cite, so I don't have to leave this on a weird question mark. After a miscommunication about a cliffhanger at the end of issue 3 caused a ton of fan speculation, the artist of the comic went onto Instagram and officially stated MCU and Marvel Comics are not the same thing. This is something that he was communicated by editorial, so this is official word from Marvel as of 2 days ago. Now, once again, I do have to put the little as of now asterisk on there because we don't know exactly what is going on in the TVA comic yet, and I'm not going to delay this video by a couple of months to find out. A lot of people are thinking that this is the comics just officially confirming that the comics multiverse has one universe or a small cluster of universes that resembles the MCU, but is not technically the same. Or if we want to get even weirder with it, this entire TVA could be a trick or illusion of some kind. There is some stuff in issue 3 that sort of hints to that. Or the status quo might change, I don't know. But again, all that I can do for purposes of these type of videos is go by the most recent canon. And right now, it has been officially stated by Marvel that the MCU and the comics are not the same thing. And it can't really get much more explicit than that, so there you go. So now we can get back to the actual topic. Hooray! The reason that I did all that was, like I said before I went on this tangent, things are about to get really weird, and they're not going to be weird in a way that is consistent with any other media. This is stuff that is unique to Marvel's Cosmology, which is what makes it so fun. At this stage, we're actually going to zoom in a tiny bit before we zoom out because I skipped ahead a little bit going to overspace, mostly because I wanted to do the waving hello to eternity bit. Before you get to these outside realms of the multiverse, you enter an area called the neutral zone or exospace. Exospace is essentially the boundary zone between the multiverse and the areas outside of it. It is described as a realm where both matter and antimatter can coexist, so as you'd expect, physics is very weird here. There's not a lot in exospace. A few mortals have been trapped here before, but talking about things that you can find naturally, there's a bunch of weird eldritch entities and a lot of this crystalline structure, which actually has a weirdly important role in Marvel video games. If you play a lot of Marvel mobile games especially, you might be familiar with the material known as ISO 8, which is a common upgrade material for characters. In the comics continuity, this is where it comes from. Moving past exospace, we are now outside of the multiverse and therefore outside of any reasonable physics. Take all your science and objective reasoning and throw them out the window. We're not going to need them for a while. There are 8 realms that we're going to cover here. Canonically, there are more, but only 8 that we've ever seen. Most of these are going to be pretty fast though, and in fact, one of them, overspace, we already talked about. Importantly, even though this is kind of the map of the multiverse section, I cannot give you a solid map of these areas, because space as a concept does not matter at this stage. What matters more when you're talking about extra multiversal realms is actually the purpose that you have for leaving the multiverse. This is where we get to see the idea of Marvel's cosmology being powered by narrative and story really applied in a practical sense. Whatever your storyline needs the realms outside the multiverse to be is going to determine where you end up. Sometimes, though, your story needs the area outside of the multiverse to be nothing, and so that cosmic void is what we will talk about first in this section, commonly known as the far shore. The far shore is nothingness. It's just big ol' infinite, empty cosmic space. There is nothing here naturally. Sometimes storylines happen here, but that's because people get exiled to the far shore from inside the multiverse most of the time. We're not gonna spend a lot of time on this one. The far shore is cool, but the explanation of how it works would just be sometimes people get stuck here, so we're gonna move on. Though the area we are moving on to is actually one that we've talked about before. It is called Beyond, and as you can probably guess, this is where the Beyonders live. What we call Beyond is actually several scattered pocket dimensions which are the remains of the second cosmos. These are the extra multiversal areas that the Beyonders use as their base of operations to observe the goings-on within the multiverse. We very rarely see the inside of Beyond, so I can't tell you too much about it, with one important exception, that being the realm known as the Library of Worlds. If I could go anywhere in the Marvel Multiverse, I would go here and stay here forever, probably. The Library of Worlds is a vast, potentially infinite library that contains, presumably, all knowledge of everything. The Beyonders created the library long ago as a sort of gift to the inhabitants of the multiverse, but would later abandon it, and now it is primarily accessed by powerful magic users and scientists, both as a source of knowledge and a meeting place. I think the library is a fascinating setting, and I really hope Marvel does more with it. As of now, it's only been seen in 2 arcs, that being 2015 Secret Wars and the lead up to it, and, say it with me, gods! I could go on an entire rant about gods again, but I will spare you all because we have other places to visit, the next one being the Well Beyond the Worlds. The Well Beyond the Worlds has only appeared in one comic ever, that being Resurrection of Magneto from 2024. Actually, most of the next couple realms are only from Resurrection of Magneto. It did a weird amount for the Cosmic Sphere. Since the Well has only appeared in this one book, there's not a lot of concrete information about it, but there is enough to go off of. It is described as being related to the very core of magic itself, which seems to mean that it is the origin of magic in some way or another. It also seems to function as an afterlife of sorts, but specifically for those who are also heavily connected to magic as a concept. Now, we're gonna branch into headcanon territory for the next part of this, but I have a theory about the Well Beyond the Worlds that I really like, so I'm just gonna go ahead and present that to you for your consideration. We know that pieces of previous cosmos can still exist outside the multiverse. This is what Beyond is, for example. We also know that the 5th cosmos was where magic originated, so I wonder if the Well Beyond the Worlds is a pocket reality that is the remnants of the 5th cosmos. It is literally referred to as the garden where magic grows, after all, so in my mind it makes total sense that this is the original prime 5th cosmos source, which is now providing magic to all the cosmos going forward. But again, headcanon, that is not official information at all. Also though, come on, it would be cool, right? I'm really putting my lore historian brain to work here. From the Well Beyond the Worlds, we can move into the Sphere of Judgment, which is actually a couple different metaphysical planes that I will classify together. The Sphere of Judgment is basically like Super Hell, though it is also described as a realm of purification, and the reason I'm going to classify it with a few others is that this really gets into the concept of afterlives, like capital A afterlives. I'm not going to go too deep into this because it would kind of move from cosmology of Marvel into religion of Marvel, a topic that I will probably never cover in detail because it would be too controversial. But to summarize really quickly, pretty much all religions in the Marvel Universe are true to some extent because Marvel has never settled on one, which makes a lot of sense. But this also means that fictional quote-unquote religions can also be true, and that's what these areas deal with. The mutants have one of these, especially important during the Krakoa era. It revolves around these extra multiversal afterlife spaces, and this is what the Resurrection of Magneto series is all about. Magneto dies, he ends up here, and then Storm goes and gets him. These afterlife realms are for the most part self-contained to that Krakoan religion though, with one exception, that being the White Hot Room. This one is very important. The White Hot Room is the home of the Phoenix Force. Remember, the Phoenix Force is a singular entity across the multiverse, so it does make sense that it would be based outside of the multiverse. It is a realm of pure light and life, and therefore it is very trippy. Originally, it also functioned as an afterlife, but specifically to those people who were hosts of the Phoenix Force at one point in their lives. In the current canon, it is way more than that though, because it's also, to my knowledge, where Krakoa is now. I'm going to explain this very quickly, but I'm going to preface this by saying there's no way this is going to make sense in total context because of how complex Krakoa was, so I'm just going to say some things and you have to take that they are true. At the end of the Krakoa era, like literally the final issues of it, the White Hot Room becomes an imminently important thing, and the Phoenix Force connects to every mutant ever, and this leads to Krakoa itself ascending to the White Hot Room, like leaving Earth and becoming a specific mutant afterlife. Which I know is an absolutely wild thing to just drop in the middle of a largely unrelated video, but yeah, that's what happened to Krakoa. It left the multiverse and is just chilling out there now. It still exists, but not in the same way at all. Back to the White Hot Room at large, there is an opposite of it called the Dark Cold Room. Yeah, I mean, that is what I guess you would call the opposite of it. Predictably, the Dark Cold Room is where the opposite of the Phoenix Force lives. The problem with that is that there are many things which have been described as the opposite of the Phoenix Force over the years, and the Dark Cold Room solves that problem by just putting them all in here and saying, yeah, I guess they're different manifestations and aspects of the same force. So here's that, and now we don't have to deal with it anymore. So yeah, answering a sidebar question, if you're curious what the opposite of the Phoenix Force is, it is all of these things at once, which are different but also the same. Does that make sense? No? Well, whatever, I don't care, this is the answer you have. Moving on past these afterlife type realms, we get to the final two realms in our multiversal journey, one of which we have also briefly talked about, that being the land of couldn't be, shouldn't be. If you recall Act -2 of this video, this is the home of the Queen of Nevers, the cosmic embodiment of possibility. As such, it's hard to describe on purpose. It is typically referred to as an empty void, but like not in the exact same way that the far shore is. It's not empty because it's just infinite space. It's empty because it is raw possibility that has not been realized. It could be anything, but it's not yet, so currently it's nothing. That felt really weird to say, but as philosophical and trippy as it sounds, it is the best description that I can think of. I really don't know what else to say about the land of couldn't be, shouldn't be, because it by definition defies solid description. It could be anything, but it's also not anything, but therefore anything that I tell you it could possibly be is also accurate to what it is, or what it at least could be at some point in the possible future. This is some Alice in Wonderland nonsense, and I really like it, but I gotta move on before I break my brain and yours. Moving on from that, well, how do we move on from that? How do we go higher on a cosmological scale past a realm of infinite nothingness that could be a realm of infinite anything? Where else is there to go? Well, there is an answer to that, and it's an answer that everything in this video has been building to. Welcome to the extra secret bonus act of this. We've done Act 1, 2, -2, and 3. Where else to go but Act Infinity, the House of Ideas? Why do I separate this into its own act? Well, I think you'll see as we go that that's the only way to do it. Before we talk about what the House of Ideas is, we have to talk about one more entity. An entity that I've mentioned a few times in this video, but always just said we've talked about later. Later has finally arrived. Let's talk about the one above all. The one above all is the pinnacle of the Marvel Multiverse. You cannot go higher in scale than this entity. And the reason that you can't go higher above this thing is that it isn't even technically part of the Marvel Multiverse, at least not entirely. The one above all is the creative energy that makes the Marvel Multiverse work. It is us in the real world as the creators and perceivers of this work. The one above all is the amalgamation of everyone in our world that makes Marvel Marvel. It is the writers, it is the artists, it is the editors, it is the lore keepers, it is the readers and fans. You watching this video right now, you are technically a tiny piece of the one above all, in a literal sense. We are deep into metafiction territory now, and we're going to go even deeper when I show you more pictures of this thing. The one above all is most commonly represented as a being of golden light, but it has taken human form before, and typically when it takes human form, it looks like Jack Kirby. Where do we see cosmic metafiction god take human form? Well, that is within the realm known as the House of Ideas. The House of Ideas kind of just looks like a normal house a lot of the time, and it's where the writing gets done. This place is very rarely seen, but my favorite example of this is when the Fantastic Four managed to explore all the way to the House of Ideas, and when they went inside, there was the one above all, sitting at his desk, drawing a comic book. To say that the one above all is all-powerful is understating it, not because it's just that strong, but because power doesn't even really apply in this sense. I occasionally see people trying to power scale the one above all. Let me give you a thought experiment here. Imagine a character in your head. Any character. Can be one you make up, can be somebody else's character, anything. Now bonk him on the head in your mind with a little hammer. You see how that character can't stop you from imagining that if you really want to? That's what we're talking about with the one above all here. It's not something that you can scale with fictional characters because it's not fictional. It's a writer. The one above all is the direct hand of the creators interfering in their own creation. In the strictest sense of the word, it's not even really a character because it is not subject to the whims of the story like all the others are. But occasionally it is. There are exceptions to this, so let's talk about those. To do this, we need to understand the entity known as the One Below All, most explored in the fantastic series Immortal Hulk. The One Below All is originally presented as a dark mirror to the One Above All. If the One Above All is goodness and creation, then the One Below All is evil and destruction. But it's actually not that simple. As this series goes on, it is revealed that the One Below All is not an opposite parallel entity to the One Above All. It is actually the same being representing itself in a different way, which has fascinating psychological and philosophical implications. See, the One Above All is typically represented as good. It is a creator force. It is what caused everything in the Marvel Universe. But thinking about it, a lot of bad stuff happens in the Marvel Universe too. Let's take a classic, the death of Uncle Ben. The One Above All created that too. So is it really good? This is the purpose of the One Below All. It is not its own being, it is the dark side of the creator. It is the acknowledgement that to make a story happen, bad things often need to be done to the characters within it. This is not strictly good, but for the purposes of storytelling and narrative, it is a necessity, and this dark necessity is what the One Below All represents. Of course, in stories like this, good typically wins, and therefore the One Below All is in a sense lesser than the One Above All. It is a being that ultimately exists to be defeated. It is weaker than creation because creation is always going to win out against destruction. If destruction wins in the end, there's no more stories to be told, and that's not going to happen. Now, even though the One Above All and the One Below All combined represent the sum total of all creation, there are exceptions to that as well, and cases in which things can arise without their influence. We've really only seen this happen once, but it's a very interesting case. This would be the Mother of Horrors, a new character to the Marvel canon who we have not yet literally seen, only heard mention of, and seen the children of. The Mother of Horrors is stated to have come into existence without the One Above All's influence. It made itself exist in some way, and this made the One Above All very angry. This is not to say that the Mother of Horrors is more powerful than the One Above All. In fact, the One Below All was able to chain it fairly easily. What I see the Mother of Horrors representing is more like the unintended consequences or interpretations of creation. The arc that we've seen the Mother of Horrors go through in her very brief existence was that she manifested, the One Above All was aware of this and became very angry, it appeared as the One Below All and chained it but did not destroy it. Much like a piece of creative work can be interpreted in ways that the creator does not like. They can try their best to suppress that, but ultimately that's not going to be something that they have full control over because people can form their own opinions. So you can try to chain the Mother of Horrors, but you cannot get rid of it completely. Now, let's address some of the contrarians in the room with regards to the One Above All. I know what the comic book audience looks like, and I'm about to read some of you so hard. Let's return to that thought experiment from a couple minutes ago where I told you to imagine a character and then bonk them on the head with a little imaginary hammer. I am absolutely certain that some of you didn't do exactly that. A few of you imagined the character dodging or catching the hammer or something else which prevented them from being hit by your strike. Now, you might think that I'm going to yell at you and say you got it wrong, but no. You actually understand this a lot more. The One Above All is an ultimate creator, yes, but ask any writer or artist and they will tell you that the things that they create can surprise them sometimes. Creation can become bigger than its creator, and that is often what the One Above All is all about. The One Above All is not some singular creator deity imposing its divine will on everything that it makes. It is a creator who is curious, who is fascinated by the things that it can make. It is intrigued by the mystery. Is the One Above All the ultimate undeniable peak of power within the Marvel Universe? Yes, no matter what storylines happen within the comics, it is the writers and the artists and the fans, like I said, and until Doctor Doom rolls up to our universe and holds the entire Marvel editorial department hostage, nothing's going to change that. But if you stop there, then you're asking these questions for the wrong reasons. The one above all does not exist to define things or control things. It exists to explore things, to be curious, to ask in true Marvel fashion the question, what if? That simple little question is the key to everything in this nearly 2-hour video. Every piece of Marvel exists because a part of the one above all asked, what if? The multiverse exists because somebody asked, what if things played out differently? Eternity exists because somebody asked, what if the multiverse was a dude? Overspace exists because somebody asked, what if a guy got big enough to talk to that dude? And so on and so forth. Everything comes down to those two simple words. Some of these answers that I've presented to you over the course of this video are going to change. Hell, a couple of them changed while I was in the middle of recording. But that's the beauty of all this, and that is one of the best things about Western comic books as a genre. They keep going, and people keep asking what if, and every time somebody does that, things change and grow and evolve, and there's always new stories to be told. Over this video, I have talked about so many things. The history of the multiverse, the entities, the structure of it from the microverse on up. It just got weirder and weirder and weirder. And the end point of all that weirdness was us. It was you, it was me, it was the writers, it was us as people. We created that weirdness, and I think that's kind of beautiful. No matter how awful the world around us might be, and believe me, it gets awful at times, humanity has always, throughout our entire history back to the Mesopotamians, been able to imagine weirdness. And as we create these things, this creation becomes a part of us. The Marvel Universe is built on this fundamentally. Narrative is woven into the literal fabric of reality, and I would argue that in a way, that's true in the real world too. Storytelling is one of the most important things that humanity has, and it's never going to stop in spite of everything. Storytelling moves ever onwards, ever upwards. In the words of the great Stan Lee, Excelsior. Thank you all so much for watching. Seriously, I mean that more than ever. This is the first time I've done a video that was like genuinely movie length, and believe me, if you think I covered a lot, there is 3 times more that I didn't cover. So if you're interested in hearing more of that, I mean, first, subscribe to me because I'm going to keep talking about it, but also go pick up a comic book and read some of this for yourself. That, above all else, is the thing that I encourage you to do. Big special shout out to Ruben Perez, the artist who drew the avatar that you've been watching talk at you for the last 2 hours. Go check him out. He always does a fantastic job, and I love working with him. And if you want to see more of Ruben's work and my work, as well as what happens when I write superhero stories of my own, check out my TTRPG show, The D and Dorks, especially the season titled Power Play. This series and a few others that I've done are part of my own superhero universe, which is titled Anti-Cosmic. I am actively working on more projects in this world, so this is very early stages. I can't promise a solid date yet, but there should be a few comic books in this setting coming out later this year. As for me, I just spent the last many hours of my life talking about cosmology for a very long time, so I'm gonna take a break. Though my break is probably going to be reading a bunch of comic books, so the vibe is not really gonna change that much. I will see you next time.